These days, UX research is commonplace at most companies, and what was once a nice to have and luxury now has a permanent seat in design processes globally. Abby is somebody who has created the seat for herself early on in her career, which led her to her first experience as a user researcher at HSBC.
So at HSBC, like I mentioned, because it was global, I got to travel around the world to test out the account opening experience. So as part of that, I traveled to New York, I traveled to London, I traveled to Dubai and Kuala Lumpur. And so that was a full month-long experience.
As a current UX research lead at Later, Abby used both her knowledge and experience to build up the company's research practices as well as its research team. And in her own words, while her career wasn't necessarily inspirational or driven by passion, it was a move to genuinely study the human condition and play to where her strengths were. I can say that this week's episode has tons of gems, including our guest herself, Abby Hoy Baylen.
So I was born and raised in Vancouver, and I am the middle child of 3. So I have an older brother and a younger brother. I like to think that my parents were the first generation immigrants here, but they actually weren't. So I actually had my great-grandfather on my dad's side, and he actually was here in the late 1800s helping out with the Canadian Pacific Railway. So it's cool that we have that level of heritage and legacy here. Yeah.
And I guess, what were you like as a child in general?
As a child, I want to say that for myself and my brothers, we were very pragmatic. So there's a story I like to tell that we were sitting in the back of the car with my mom, and my mom asked us if we wanted to go to Disneyland. And all 3 of us piped up and said, no! And I think that level of practicality, might I say that we also said, it's a waste of money. And so it's such a strange kind of mindset to have as a child, but we had that growing up. And that's just kind of what I carried forward, just being a very practical person.
Did you think that, I guess that mentality came from your parents? Did they kind of raise you in that practical sense?
Yeah, definitely. Again, as a child of immigrants, you had to kind of scrimp and save. I was raised in a home where we lived on top of a store, and it was 1 bedroom for the 5 of us. And I was living in that situation until I was about 7 or 8 years old. And then that's when we actually moved into a bigger home.
And kind of moving more towards eventually in high school and stuff like that. I'm kind of just curious what kind of careers you kind of aspired to have before heading into university.
Yeah, I never told my mom, but not until later on as an adult, that I wanted to be an artist. And it was because I wasn't that great at it, but I enjoyed creating art. And moving into high school, I really enjoyed my graphic arts class. Otherwise, I was a very good student, right? Performed well.
I guess if you kind of contrast the practicality as well as being an artist, I think this is a conflict that I had as well growing up. I told my mom I wanted to be at one point it was a rapper. At one point it was just a graphic designer. I didn't even know what design was prior to high school. So I guess, did you ever have that conversation with your parents about practicality, careers, and your future in general?
Practicality always trumped, right? For me, I knew that whatever I chose, I would, this sounds horrible, but I would have to make money, right? I would have to make money soon. And it was just whatever path was easiest to that. And that really guided my way going forward. Again, I don't want to... I want to be sensitive about the whole immigrant story, but you come, especially when my parents, they had to come from such a hard life. There was that time during their generation, it was the Cultural Revolution, right? And so during that time, families were ripped apart from each other. And some parts of the families had to go to the farms, right? And they had to really work and break their backs for a living, just for food, right? And so for them to come and move here for us and to create a life for their children, I really needed to keep that in mind and move towards something that could create returns.
Right. You wanted to make sure that whatever sacrifice your parents were making was at least gonna return something, like whether or not it's just making them proud or just even being able to sustain yourself. I think, yeah, I had these kind of grandiose ideas when I was younger. And then I think when I moved into university, I started just feeling like, yeah, I actually do need to make a living, and like whatever ambitions I had kind of just needed to take the backseat for a while. And I'm actually curious about your university experience because after high school, you end up going to UBC and you're in the Faculty of Commerce. Kind of what was the idea behind that? What kind of careers did you aspire to have?
Yeah, I mean, again, pulling back to that pragmatic sense of mindset that I had, it was going to commerce and business was really the best way forward, right? It created, there were the most options that were presented there. Um, I mean, I wasn't particularly great at science. I was okay at it. And for me, arts wasn't really an option, right? And so business was really the best option. And then I researched beforehand about co-op opportunities. And so I knew that the most, I suppose, lucrative way forward was to go to any faculty that had co-op opportunities.
And while you were at Sauder, you actually also specialized in management information systems. Was there a particular reason around that?
Again, they had at the time, and I think there was another one, perhaps T-Log, had some co-op opportunities. So I knew that that was my way forward, right? And that was a great way to get experience early and to get my foot in the door after I graduated.
Around the idea of information systems and like technology and stuff like that. Were you particularly interested in technology when you were growing up?
No, I even today, I have to say that it's always a miracle and a blessing that I am in the technology field, because all in all, what I focus on is more on the human side of technology. It's not so much on the technology itself. And with management information systems, there were parts of it that focus on the human side, like organizational behavior. And there was, the major part about management information system is around doing the analysis and doing some level of understanding organizational change.
Do you think that majoring in that helped you kind of get to where you wanted to be eventually after university?
Absolutely, like it opened doors for me. Back then, technology was really it was there was a lot to be defined. It was the burgeoning of the dot-com era, really. And so there was a lot of excitement around that.
And you talked about co-op as well. What kind of co-op experiences did you kind of leave university with?
Yeah, with co-op, there was a variety of different experiences. So from a business perspective, you could either go into more of an analyst role or go into a bit more creating databases, right? And then there were web roles. So I moved into web roles with my co-op experience. So I ended up working for the federal government. And I worked for a place called West Tech Information Systems. And in both of those areas, I supported like the intranets that they had.
I also kind of want to touch back on this interesting point you made about kind of like the human side of technology. What particularly did you, I guess, resonate with that kind of made you think in that direction?
Yeah, that's such an interesting, good question. And around the same time, I was doing a lot of volunteer work. And the volunteer work was actually with the church. And what I was a youth counselor. And actually, for the next decade, I was counseling youth from the ages of grade 7 to the time that they graduated. And so there was definitely that side of human connection that influenced how I worked and just who I was as a person.
And did you feel like you could kind of achieve those goals and kind of motivations through the work that you were doing?
Yeah, that's interesting because, at the time research wasn't really a thing, right? The human side of technology wasn't really a thing, really. It was just, if we were to take a look at it a bit more further, it was about the web and then understanding how do people work with the web.
It's interesting that you're mentioning this because I think as well when I was growing up I didn't really see that kind of user-centric side of things. I always felt as a software developer or anybody who was working in that field, it was either you were a developer or you were somebody in business. The role of design actually I don't think really resonated with me until I actually really kind of thought about like how people were able to design like such intricate systems that covered um, a wide set of use cases. And moving into kind of like your first role at West Tech, as you mentioned, you were there as a web consultant. So kind of what responsibilities did you have?
Yeah, it was so I got a job there as co-op, and then after I graduated, they hired me. So at the same time, I continued on my responsibilities of managing the intranet, their extranet, and to some degree, looking after some of the external website features for BC Hydro. I was self-taught in terms of the web, and so understanding HTML and CSS. Back then, I don't know if I should say this, but Flash was a thing.
Okay.
But
I think Tim mentioned that in the first
oh
episode.
no,
But
yeah,
I won't mention again.
yeah.
It's around that.
um, but so there was a lot of self-taught skill set involved there. So I was creating a lot of interfaces. I was designing those intranets. I was coding them, and I can't say that I was especially good, but I wasn't particularly bad either.
In that sense, when you said that a lot of these things had to kind of be self-taught, what do you think specifically transferred from your experience at university onto this first job?
It's funny because we didn't actually learn so much of that in university, right? But the opportunities at that time, it was so ripe, so that if you could teach yourself, you could actually get into a lot of different places.
And did you kind of get inspired to go into research within this first role as well, or?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. So, it's primarily design focused. And then it was interesting. One of my colleagues introduced the concept of usability testing to me. And from then on, it was just like, well, why don't we start usability testing this site and this site just to see how people use it, right? And so you start asking questions. And back then, our clients were primarily within the utilities industry. So BC Hydro was a major client of ours. So I would run across the street to the BC Hydro office and sit down with people and go through some usability testing.
And when you were presenting this kind of stuff, what kind of feedback were you met with, I guess?
Yeah, it was. I think there was a certain degree of buy-in for it, but it wasn't so strong enough that it warranted itself, that its own like research component to it. Yeah.
I guess like at the time, I'm just kind of curious what people's mentalities were actually around research. Was it something that people felt like was kind of a necessity, or do you think it was more seen as like a nice to have?
Yeah. So at that time, it was a nice to have. It really was a nice to have. And what was good about it, the times that we were able to run it, was that speaking to our customers, they felt heard, right? I think that was a major impact. Once they felt heard, and we could hear from the end user that this helped them or that didn't help them, and this was working well, but this didn't work well. They really want to see more of XYZ than this. Then that really helped inform how we can create a better experience.
Now that you've had exposure to this kind of experience, I guess was it so profound that you decided that you wanted to move into this field?
No, it wasn't. What it was interesting was that it opened up the field of design to have that human component to it. For design, it was just so much about getting your head in the game and creating something, but without the feedback of the end user, right? You had the task at hand and you were supposed to build it. And so this introduced a different facet to what design could be.
So after staying at West Tech for a number of years, you end up transitioning into HSBC eventually, which a lot of people know as a bank and financial institution. And I believe your first role over there was a user researcher. So I'm kind of just curious how you made that jump.
Yeah, I'm going to have to rewind back and tell you a story about how I actually arrived at moving into kind of more UX user research stuff. And so back when I was at West Tech, I was designing this login screen. And then for this login screen for BC Hydro, it was an app for maybe like a piping system or something like that. And so I had somehow created this login screen with a bunch of intersecting pipes. And the project manager at that time took that design to the stakeholders in a meeting and tried to get their approval for the design. And one of the stakeholders raised his hand and said, excuse me, does anyone see a swastika? I see swastikas in this design.
Oh my God.
And the project manager said, okay, good to know. Brought it back to me and she said, no more crossing pipes, nothing.
Oh my God.
Don't want anything.
Right.
Wow. And so I knew from that point on that design was not going to be my thing. Right. And if I could refocus somehow, it would be more towards UX. And then when I got the job at HSBC, it was originally for a UX architect position. So creating the wireframes, doing the IA, similar to what you're doing today. And from there, as a UX architect, we underwent some reorg. And from a reorg perspective, they saw that I was a better fit as a user researcher based on my skill set.
I just want to dial it back even just a little bit because of this just kind of like experience that you had. Oh my God. I can't imagine kind of just going into, or not even going into, but kind of like just being at work and then just seeing that in your head. That must have been kind of traumatic. Do you think eventually you got rid of that, or is that something that you still kind of think about?
Well, it's kind of horrifying as a female and as an immigrant to inadvertently design a swastika. That's quite the experience, right? And it's a bit of a damning experience for me.
Well, I mean, I think it also kind of opened up at least more of a specialization that you could actually see yourself in. So that's really nice. You mentioned that at HSBC it was kind of more towards like that role of UX, and they eventually kind of just positioned you more towards the research side of things. What were the research processes that were established there?
It was new. We were a fairly new team. We had ties to digital, but at the time we were a growing team as well. So the director worked so that we would eventually become a global team. So in becoming a global team, we helped create the standards for the rest of the bank from a digital perspective in terms of research and UX. It was a process to really create all of those standards and policies in place. So it was a work in progress.
Did you feel like the role of UX and like research at the time was motivated by something in particular, or was this kind of like just in the whole era of people moving towards that kind of standard for companies?
Yeah, I think at the time, the financial industry, they were starting to get into more and more digital banking, and there was more and more interest to it. And so it coincided at the time because HSBC is in the interest of acquiring other banks and financial institutions. You have a lot of different types of systems, right? And so the CEO at that time had a strong interest in terms of aligning all of these systems together, right? And so in aligning the systems, it would also meant aligning the experiences.
And what was just the general experience? Because you were a user researcher there for a number of years, and I imagine there was probably like a lot of different projects that you were working on there. What do you remember about any particular like experiences on that team?
Yeah, I mean, it was a really good team. We were a global team, and so I worked with a lot of researchers within the U.S. and with Hong Kong as well. Um, Working for the bank was really, it could be really difficult at times, right? Because we had to respond from a global perspective. So everyone that we could be speaking with, they could be, at the other end of the time zone for us, right? And so I remember for a good number of years, I was up at 5 a.m. taking calls, and then at 9 p.m. that same day, also taking calls with Hong Kong.
And were these calls like with kind of just coworkers, or was this like with clients and the people that you would eventually do research on?
It was more the latter. So it was with our stakeholders, right? And so with our global stakeholders. So in the morning at the 5 a.m.s, I could be having meetings or getting status updates from other parts of the bank because we were working on global projects together, right? And so I'd be on the call with New York and with Europe and with Dubai, and so it was a lot of work, and it was a struggle, I think, to always try to get people at the same in good time at good times and be focused on trying to provide something of value.
So you were kind of like exposed to the remote work culture even before it was like mainstream.
Exactly. And that's how it is when you're working for a global institution, right? That's the norm.
And I guess going from West Tech, where I would imagine it's a little bit more in person, and then suddenly having to do like just a multitude of remote and slash like this in office work, what kind of mentality did you kind of develop from that?
Uh, you know, HSBC really put me through the ringer, right? And so from that, everything else was kind of easy to some extent, right? And so because it also put my mental health pushed it to a certain point where it was really difficult to work at times, and I would just kind of cringe at it. But I don't regret any of it. That's the thing. I don't regret it because it made me stronger in the end. So I feel like it was a really crucial point in my career. And it just paved the way for future jobs that I would take.
Even before working at HSBC, what kind of motivated you to even apply there in the first place? Were you particularly interested in like working at a bank or like financial institution?
No. I feel like back then, not that it was that long ago, but there were just less options, right? And so when this opportunity opened up, I had a friend who moved on to HSBC. And then so she was the one who said, Abby, would you like to come work here? And I thought, my gosh, to work for an international company, what an awesome experience that could be. That could open a lot of doors for me, right? Rather than working for local utilities for the rest of my life, right?
And I guess at the time as well, you mentioned that user research was more of a nice to have than a dire role that needed to be filled. So I guess in that sense, a lot of these bigger companies probably were the only ones who could have the resources to actually execute that.
Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. To be honest, user research wasn't really the end goal, right? User research wasn't really a thing, really. And even after I was reorged and to put into the user research team, that was still brand new to me. I had to learn a lot of that skill set as well, right? And so luckily enough, I had some really good colleagues who studied a lot of HCI. And then I learned from them. I considered some of them my mentors.
So I kind of wanted to ask you a question about working as a UX researcher. When I studied design, like in university, through my projects, a lot of the user research that we did was kind of like in person and kind of just watching over the people's shoulders about like how they actually interact with things. I'm kind of curious from HSBC. Did you have a combination of both in person and like remote user experience research? And kind of what were the drawbacks and benefits of either of those?
Yeah, I love that question. So at HSBC, like I mentioned, because it was global, we were kind of, I wouldn't want to say the first, but it was the norm to do some level of remote research. But at the same time, we also did in person. So I'll point to one prime example. It was at HSBC that myself and a colleague, we were on a project for account opening. So back then, online account opening wasn't really a thing. So to do online account opening on a global perspective, we were tapped on to travel around the world. So I got to travel around the world to test out the account opening experience. So as part of that, I traveled to New York, I traveled to London, I traveled to Dubai and Kuala Lumpur. And so that was a full month long experience. And all of that was obviously in person. And the amount of work in general for doing in-person studies is significant, right? Because everything, there's just so much more overhead to it, right? Because you have to make sure that, say you print off all of your facilitation guides. You have to make sure all the cameras are set up. And back then, we actually did some eye tracking with these studies as well. And so I was lugging, myself and my colleague, we were lugging a 50-pound Tobii eye tracker around the world.
Right. Those were the hardware ones, right? That,
The
like,
hardware monitors.
Right.
The monitors. It was the monitors that did the eye tracking. So it wasn't the glasses that you have now. And so we would lug this around the world. And can you imagine like putting a 50-pound suitcase luggage in the overhead bin because you couldn't check it in because it's such delicate equipment.
It's so fragile.
Yeah, it's so fragile. And so that was the kind of experience that I had in doing in-person in-person testing.
And what were the benefits of doing that over remote? Did you have a chance to do remote testing as well when you were at HSBC?
Yeah, I did. And in terms of the benefits of doing in person, I can't say that it's that much more than doing remote, right? Other than the opportunity that you get to have in reading the room. So it depends on the type of study. So if you're running, say, focus groups, then it's great to have it in person because you can read the room a lot better, right? But if it's one-on-one, it's actually not that bad, and especially depending on the topic. So if we're just testing out account opening, it's not as big a deal as compared to trying to test out like a handheld app that's built for people who are on the field, right? If they're on the field, then that's where you do the one-on-one. That's where you reap the benefits because you understand what the environment is about.
This kind of makes me think about two different scenarios. Number one, you were talking about this idea of doing group studies, and I've seen this episode of Silicon Valley where they're just testing out like their new product in front of a group. And one of the questions that I have coming from what we're talking about is kind of when you're doing a study on a product with a group, do you think the group think kind of mentality kind of takes over at some point, and you think people just start riffing off of each other and like kind of just agreeing to a conclusion as a group rather than thinking on their own?
Yes, that definitely happens. And so that with those, you kind of have to think about different activities to counteract that, right? So the great thing about focus groups is that they're good for ideation. They're good for brainstorming. So maybe riffing off is actually a good thing to have. You can't use focus groups to help you test something that's existing.
Yeah, like another question that I had around the idea of doing in-person research is about like, I guess the seriousness and like the kind of when you have like a setting in place, and I feel like some people are kind of suddenly forced to kind of act in a very serious manner, and they kind of maybe potentially overthink how to use a product. Do you think having that kind of setting in place kind of distills kind of an unfair bias when it comes to truly like getting genuine research out of it?
Yeah, I don't know. The onus is really on the facilitator, right, to create that environment of comfort. But I agree, it's a very it could be very awkward to be asked to come into this sterile room where there is a double pane mirror. And so I had to run the lab for Sage software locally, and so we had a back room looking. So you're right. In some ways, it did seem like an interrogation room, right? And so, so then that's where your facilitation skills really have to come into place, where you can put everyone at ease.
I was just gonna say, when you were talking about the double pane, I thought
Yeah.
that was literally just like a movie thing, but
No,
okay, you guys did that.
it's
Did you
real.
build the room specifically for that activity?
Well, when I got there, it was already built.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Right. It was already built. So, and then we would use software to stream it to the back and record the sessions.
And yeah, just for our listeners, I just want to say that this is a role that Abby would eventually move on to later on. But dialing it back into HSBC, I'm curious about the transition that you made between roles at the company. Because you started off there as a user researcher, but eventually started making your way towards customer experience research. Or was that was the second role, right?
Yeah. And so when you work for large institutions, it's very normal to go through a number of reorgs, and that means also going through a number of role title changes. So being a user researcher and a customer experience consultant was practically the same thing. But in being a customer experience consultant at that time, I was leading the UX from both a design and a research perspective.
What does customer experience mean actually in that scenario?
Well, I mean, in that scenario, I was looking after, like I mentioned, the UX and the research for work streams. So that particular work stream that I was responsible for was something called entitlements. Entitlements has to do with the permissions for commercial banking online, right? And so at the time, I was in charge of how does that look like for our customers, say the Nikes of the world who used, I'm just saying if they used HSBC, right? How would they set the permissions and access for the rest of their employees if they had to access online banking? And so that was a very, very complex piece of work. And took about 2 years of my life. In the end, it was shelved, like many projects at the bank. But it was so that was what the customer experience bit was. So we did do good amount of usability testing, and it was also getting the designs reviewed. And then I'm guessing your next part of the question was, how did I move on to a business process consultant?
Yeah, and I was kind of curious about what those responsibilities were, because it just seemed like, I guess the way that I'm thinking about this is that you started off as a web consultant and then kind of niched down in towards like the research stuff, and then it almost feels like you kind of umbrellaed out again into kind of more of a general business role. And I'm curious if that was just kind of a title reflection rather than the actual responsibilities that you did.
Yeah. So there's a lot of politics involved, right? And at the time when I was a CX consultant, a bunch of my colleagues were also CX consultants. It coincided with a time where there were a lot of layoffs at the bank. And so that's where I saw my entire team get laid off. I was one of the few who remained. They decided to keep me, but it was also because I was pregnant, right? And because my team had dissolved, people were looking out for me to see what other opportunities there were.
I see.
And so there was this business process consultant type of role for Bank Canada specifically. And so that's how I moved into it. It's not because I necessarily wanted to, it was out of survival.
Got it. Yeah, because I guess that kind of came out of the shelving of your project, I would assume. Okay. Did you enjoy the role in general, I guess, when you kind of look back at it?
Like I said, I never regretted it. I think that it provided so much value. Probably at the time, though, I know at the time I hated part of it. Yeah.
And how long did you stay in HSBC in general?
I think it was about 7 or 8 years.
And then after 7 to 8 years, you eventually move on into another company. And I guess at this time, it was a lot better for you because you actually moved back into the research role. And this was at a company called Sage. And I looked them up. It seems like they're like an all-in-one kind of small to medium-sized business solution for like things like taxes and anything like financial related. Um, was it a natural transition to go from a financial institution into a product that dealt so much with the financial aspect of running a business?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sage, they specialize in accounting software. So they, like you mentioned, it ranges from small to medium, but also to enterprise level. So I don't know if our listeners out there know ACPAC, but ACPAC is an enterprise level solution. So
And when you made that transition as well, you went from an enterprise level where I'm assuming you dealt with like thousands and thousands of employees. And when moving to Sage, I think that transition must have been kind of just a difference in the level of magnitude. Because I know Sage still has a lot of people, but I guess when you kind of look at it, right, in terms of like all the moving parts, you're still moving from like a fairly big organization into one that's a little bit smaller. What was the reflection in the UX research processes like based on the jump in magnitude?
yeah, it was a lot more focused, to be honest, right? And the teams were smaller, significantly smaller when it came to research. But then that was actually a really good thing, right? I think it provided us a level of granularity and clarity that we needed.
And when you're working with like a company that's a little bit just more in line with the processes, I guess there's probably a bigger research team that you actually work with there, I would assume.
No, at Sage it was smaller, but what happened was that in contrast with HSBC, at Sage I was a lot more closer to the product. So I was closer to, you're always close to the designers, but I was closer to the developers as well. And so we worked together in the same floor, same area.
And I want to dial it back because we talked about this earlier, and I kind of want to move this into this segment. But you talked about these kind of research settings when you're doing like in-person research. I kind of wanted to just touch on the idea of having like a double paned mirror in like a set room and doing user interviews. Like, could you kind of like paint us a picture of what that looked like at Sage?
Yeah, so at Sage, so this is how it worked. In terms of recruitment, I would have a third party help me with the recruitment. And so for every no-show that we would get, we would actually have someone who was a backup. It's a lot of work actually for people to travel to the office as well. And so they would be waiting in a waiting room, just like anybody would be if they're waiting for an appointment. I would call them into this room and they would see a monitor set up for them to work on, a number of cameras that would be focused on what they're doing, obviously 2 chairs for themselves and myself, and it's usually in a boardroom, a fairly small boardroom. And behind them, so that they're not facing themselves, behind them is the mirror, and that's the double pane mirror. And behind the double pane mirror are our observers.
I see. And when you were doing that, I'm curious about like this kind of waiting room situation and also about like the compensation, because I know when people do research nowadays, they're compensated fairly like generously, I would say. What was the model of compensation for you guys at the time?
It was pretty generous too, because the compensation is also in line with the occupation, right? So at the time, at Sage, people's occupation, it would be accounting, right? And if they are required to leave their office to come travel, who knows how long, to our office, then we would compensate them fairly.
Why did you feel like you needed to have people in person?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. I think I was carrying forward traditions to some extent. The company had invested into building this room, right, to do a lot of these tests and research. And so it was also an opportunity for a bunch of product people to go into the back room, chat and talk amongst themselves as they observed, right? It was in some ways a enriching and building experience for them to understand what research was about.
Got it. And it's kind of like a similar situation that we have right now. When we do user research, we also have like couple of like the product owners, we have the developers, we have like the designers, and even other researchers in kind of just looking in. Yeah, and kind of just like being in that experience and catching like all of those little nuances.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say that technology has really democratized that whole research experience, whether it be in person or not. But it's actually, it has shifted it towards remote so much so, especially with COVID, right? That it actually levels the playing field. Because when you have in-person testing and recruit people to come to the office, automatically you're assuming that they have access to transportation, right? And that they have time, that they can afford to come, right? But by cutting out a lot of that overhead, then you're opening up the playing field. And at the same time, for one-on-one testing, you're limiting it from a geographical perspective, right? You can only recruit locally, whereas remote, you can recruit globally.
Do you remember when that transition between having more in-person researching and kind of like remote researching? Do you remember when it kind of equalized and you kind of had a bit of both at work?
Yeah, I think it happened once I started. I think once I started working on apps where perhaps the development, they weren't on site, and I also wanted to push recruitment for people that are outside of local, because we could get so many more different types of opinions, right? Insights from different people.
And was this at Sage as well?
And this was at Sage, yeah.
Got it. I have to ask this just because
Yes.
my knowledge of like kind of like the development of kind of remote researching technologies is kind of limited, but was there screen sharing at the time?
Yes.
Or like, okay.
There was screen sharing even back at HSBC, so early 2000s.
Got it.
Yeah, so there was screen sharing back then as well.
And when you were doing research on like mobile apps, I guess, was there a way for them to actually share what was on their screen and you could actually see what they were doing?
So what was happening, so what we did was for mobile apps at Sage, we had set up a camera that faced the mobile app on the table, right? And so that's how we would film people where they would click.
Kind of like an overhead, and you're kind of seeing their...
Exactly.
Okay, interesting. And I guess to kind of close that off, how long were you at Sage for?
I was there for, I think, about three and a half years, maybe.
Okay. Did you feel like towards the end of that role, you were ready to move on into something else?
I was ready to move on. I was also forced to move on because, again, there was reorg. And so there was myself and my team, the research team, we were actually let go.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So it was a blessing in disguise.
So as you mentioned, it was kind of like a blessing in disguise. You would eventually move on to later in around 2017, 2018. And I was talking to Billy in the last episode about this. And you guys joined kind of like around the same time as well. How many employees do you remember later having at the time?
Yeah, when I joined, it was about 30 or so employees.
And were you the only researcher there?
Yes, I was the first researcher there.
Wow. Okay. Did you feel like they had a certain process in place for you to start doing your research?
No. So when I was hired, I was actually hired to do double duty. I was hired as a user researcher, but I was also hired to do UX writing. So technically, Well, technically, the first UX writer and researcher was Roger, CEO. But then afterwards, I was hired to do both.
Interesting. And do you remember kind of like what your feeling was when you were, first getting introduced to what later was, and kind of like even being interested in taking on that role? Like what kind of things kind of went through your mind?
I was thinking, gosh, this is a fast-paced place. I'm not used to this, right? And so it really forced me to think quickly on my feet and to learn really quickly.
Right. How did you learn about later in the first place?
Um, y- I, when you're applying for jobs, you apply for everything, right? And so later was one of those places that was really interesting to me. And what was interesting was that it was local and it was developed, like it started off locally.
I see. And do you remember what that interview process was like for you?
Yeah, I remember it being pretty casual to some extent. I had Roger, I had Billy, and at the time I had Jennifer as well in the meetings as well. I presented my project, and for me it was just like a switch because I had done so many presentations in the past with people that I knew what I had to do, and so it was a good thing. Obviously, I was nervous. Yeah.
Hmm. I was gonna ask, kind of like just going from kind of enterprise to like a bit of a smaller company, and then suddenly to like a really really small startup, I guess. Did you feel like you just had enough experience from those prior experiences to kind of take this on and understand that you were going to be the only researcher there?
Yeah, for me, it wasn't a problem because, again, HSBC, it was such a good experience. They just put me through the ringer in terms of how to set process and guidelines in place. What does good research look like? So that going forward, I knew how to establish that as a practice within later.
I guess in that sense, when you were kind of developing the research processes at later, did you feel like you had to draw a lot from not only your experiences at your previous companies, but also other researchers in the field? Like how was the process of building up those internal procedures for you?
Yeah, it was pretty easy, to be honest, because and this is where I'm going to compare more startup research environments versus enterprise environments for research. And a few of the key things revolve around speed, right? Autonomy and access, right? So speed within later to run research is very scrappy. So, or any type of small startup growth company, it's scrappy and you could do it quickly, right? I guess the process doesn't matter as much as for when you're working with an enterprise company where you have to get NDA signed and you have to get certain access to what the customer list is. I had to jump through a number of hoops, right? So that's tied from a speed and access perspective to resources.
And kind of just looking back at your time at later, how have you been enjoying it so far?
Oh, I love it. I love it. Yeah, it's been probably the best experience that I've had
Why do you think so?
because of the people, right? I work with extremely talented and smart people, and
Could you say who?
Joey.
Just kidding.
Sorry. But like I won't say who, but I would say like everybody is really smart and talented, and to be part of something that is growing is really humbling, right? The people that I work with, what makes them smart is that they can think quickly and they're nimble, right? And those are some of those core values within later.
And I think it's a mentality that is kind of universal across people who work in startups usually. I feel like they're just a little bit more invested in the product than most people who kind of just work normal kind of like 9 to 5.
Yeah, and there's that level of support as well, right? I think in larger companies, everyone is in their silo, and everyone has a sense of and it's not a bad thing, but they have a sense of ownership over what they have. So there's a level of control, right? And within later, a lot of that is free for all, right? I can approach development and ask them a question, and they don't have to talk to their manager to see if they have approval to give you this information. I can go to data, I can go to marketing, and I can work with the UX directly. You know what I mean?
There's less kind of like
less hoops to jump through.
Less hoops to jump into. And I think also like when you work at a big company, I feel like people just automatically start thinking about like office politics and stuff like that, and always feeling like, oh, you know, these people are only going to like these socials in order to like climb up the corporate ladder and stuff like that. Like it's a lot of like, it's a lot of motivations that are tied to kind of like just being able to like evolve in your career. And I think at later, one thing that I've noticed is that people are just a little bit more genuine about their intentions. And to your point about like kind of jumping through hoops and stuff like that, it almost kind of feels like later is also like, I hate to say that, you know, when companies say like, oh, our company is like a family, like everybody kind of
oh gosh, yeah,
like stuff like that.
Yeah.
I almost like to think that later in a way is not so much as a family, but it almost feels like we're all just, you know, like students in university who are just working on like a really, really big project. Like we're all friends to some capacity, I would say, but it definitely does feel a little bit more natural, especially when you talk to like these people outside of work and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that one of the differences is that we're all really aligned on the vision. We're all bought into the vision, right? And that we know that we have each other's backs. It's not about me versus you, right? About who would be recognized earlier or faster, right? And it's less about that, and it's about how can we work together to achieve this vision to make our company succeed. Really, that's what it is.
And in that kind of towards that kind of like thinking as well, I know the UX research team has been growing kind of steadily over the past few years, and within the past 2 years actually, I think we've gained at least 4 of them, right, all at once. So now you guys are like a team of 5 people. I guess, did you naturally just assume that leadership position out of necessity, or is this something that you also think that you kind of operate better in?
I mean, yes, it is part of necessity. There wasn't going to be a new hire to be a research manager. At the same time, I've had enough experience leading teams to progress this and to make it a natural progression at that.
Do you enjoy being kind of like a research manager?
I do. It makes it easier that I have a really lovely team to work with. Yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna have Danka in on a later episode, but yeah, I'm just glad that kind of like the state of research at later is being held in good hands. So it feels good when you can kind of have that level of communication with them as well. Like you said before, there's not really like a natural hierarchy that exists, and I feel like I can have an open conversations with any of them really. So that's really good.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. We're all invested in the same thing. And we are growing. We are hiring.
Look out, later.com/careers. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit more about industry stuff related to research. And one of the topics that I've seen pop up a lot is kind of the differences between qualitative and quantitative data. And usually when people are able to attach certain numbers and especially with volume, oftentimes I feel like there's a sort of glorification of quantitative data that kind of is set on a pedestal, at least compared to qualitative data. And I'm kind of wondering about your stance on the two and which kind of scenarios would serve which form of data better.
Well, both are extremely valuable. And the thing is with insights from a product perspective, it's helpful to know the entire story. And so just to have quantitative data is not necessarily enough. What quantitative data will tell you is the what, but qualitative data will tell you the why. So then you can only understand a part of the picture when you're looking at the quantitative. You'll understand what our users are doing. Say you'll understand that, yes, they are buying apples. In fact, they are buying many apples. Do you know why? I have no idea why.
And when you're having to have like when you have qualitative data as well, I feel like it makes sense to almost quantify it in a way. For example, if you were to describe the reasons why users sign up for later in the first place, right? There could be a multitude of qualitative data, but ultimately at the end, you always have to quantify it. And do you think a lot of the power of qualitative data really comes from the mass quantities of it in general?
Yeah, so it ranges, right? And so, yes, I agree. There should be a quantitative aspect behind that's driving the qualitative data. It doesn't make sense for you to just pick out one particular insight and say that this is what people are doing, because there's not enough data to support that. What I tell my team is to look at patterns. And what creates patterns is quantity, right? You can't have a pattern with just one thing, right?
Do you think when you're designing a survey and sending it out to people, is there kind of like a test batch that you do with your research questions that you kind of send out to a smaller group and then kind of see what kind of information you're getting out of it and then somehow tweak it? Or do you kind of just build it up and kind of just evaluate it as a team and then just send it out?
Yeah, it's much more the latter. So we'll build it up internally, and then we'll have it vetted through with the stakeholders to make sure that we're including options that they're interested in, and then we'll roll it out.
I see. So it's not like you're iterating on surveys in a way. At least not like with a direct project in mind. I feel like you're always going to be iterating as you progress in a career, but it's never like you're A/B testing a survey in particular.
No, but that's an interesting idea. The reason why we don't do that is that, first off, it takes time, right? And in order for us to, I guess, make a change, we would probably have to wait until we get enough results, right? And so after a certain amount of results, then we'll be like, oh, I'm not sure about this. That means we would have to stop it and then start over again. So, but more often than not, we vet it internally to such a degree that we don't have to.
There's a certain level of confidence that you have in the survey itself. And when you're talking about getting enough results, is there a certain number or benchmark of responses that you're looking for?
Yeah, I don't want to say that this is going to be the benchmark that everyone should have, but certainly for the number of customers and users that we have, I'd like to probably benchmark it between 700 to 1,000 respondents.
And is this kind of like a percentage of like the user base that you think would be enough to kind of provide a statistically significant value for the results to actually be relevant?
Yeah, there's a statistical significance part, but there's also the degree of confidence, right? Okay. And so when having at least 700 respondents, then you have a plus or minus 3 margin of error, right? And so that closes the gap pretty significantly, and that helps us to deliver something with more confidence.
Okay. So it should always kind of be a reflection of your potential users, because I guess in business, right, we think about like the total addressable market, and then like your and then segmenting it down all the way until like you find like your core number of users. And I guess in that sense as well, you're taking the number of users that your product has in general and then picking a certain percentage of it and then saying, if we get results in the ballpark range of this number of users, then we can say that with confidence, these results are going to be accurate reflection of the larger group.
Correct. So with that larger group, the difference between surveying with 10,000 users versus 100,000 users, your results won't be significantly different.
Interesting. Okay.
Right. And so if it's fine to survey with a smaller amount, and that's why I cap it off at around 700 to 1,000.
Do you think that we usually get that kind of a number of users, Ben?
We definitely can with the base that we have, and depending on what type of survey and who it's being released to. Yeah, for the most part, unless it's a very, very specific feature for a very specific segment.
Yeah. So because of the order that we work in, I often find that there's kind of like these different sections of user research that kind of take place before a feature is even developed, in kind of like discovering what we should even build in the first place. And then you have more research that's kind of like evaluating the performance of features that we've just developed and trying to see whether or not this is ready for the market in the first place. So the kind of distinguishing feature between those two sets of research, to my knowledge, is formative and summative data. So my question is more on the formative piece of data, which is kind of like the research that you do beforehand. I'm kind of curious about how open-ended you make those research studies in order to inform any potential significance to inform like what kind of features we should actually be developing.
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question, something that I've been trying to work with my team on and with product on. So because we work so closely with product, how it typically works is that I have a sense of the roadmap that's going to be coming down the pipe, right? For all of the features that we could be potentially working on. And so then I work with the POs, or my team works with the POs directly, and we try to understand, what do we need to do now? And then what questions do they have that they don't have the answers to? And so for the questions that they have that we don't have the answers to, that's something that we would plan for to try to answer within the cycle, or prior to the next cycle. And so that's how we try to work from a formative perspective, right? We try to get ahead of the game. And so because the POs, they're constantly thinking about the future as well, right? And so we work with them, but also we're trying to get to the point where we can work proactively and preemptively from a research perspective. So if we see opportunities where we need to do research, then, or we see particular gaps or white spaces and realize that, hey, we don't actually have the answers to this, or we notice that there's some interesting trends that's happening here that perhaps the POs or haven't seen yet, we'll try to do that initial digging.
Okay. And for those listening, PO is a product owner, which we kind of use as a term in lieu of product manager. But a couple of really interesting points that you made over there. So number one, you guys kind of work with the POs directly to kind of translate those business goals into research goals, which I guess is a really good way of demonstrating kind of like the difference between the two that we've previously just talked about. And then you're also talking about working ahead of the cycle, which is also an interesting take, because I guess, yeah, without that roadmap, you really wouldn't understand kind of like what are the next things that you need to develop. I guess where I was kind of thinking with that question was along those lines as well, because I kind of wonder how open-ended you want it to be. Because I guess at the end of the day, you don't necessarily want users depicting what you should be building for them, right? Because there's a common saying that if you ask people back then what they wanted faster horses, right? And then you wouldn't never develop the car. So that's kind of just an interesting tidbit that I'm getting from what you've just said.
Yeah, exactly. So what's important is that you have some level of a North Star, right? And so that's why we have that roadmap to help point us in the direction of, okay, this is where the company is heading in terms of what features to build or how we want to position ourselves, right? And so then what research can we provide to help, I guess, equip us to get there?
Okay. And when you're kind of doing that research as well, do you think it's important that you get everybody in that conversation? Like, as much as you're having a conversation just with the POs, do you think there's any benefit to having outside perspective when being able to conduct those research studies?
So there are a couple of ways that we could have external input into research, and one is from a competitive standpoint, right? And so competitively, we'll look at other players within the industry, see how they're performing, right? And then have that input into, what does this actually look like? How could this look like for us? And the other external input that we would have from a survey perspective, potentially, is that we do a lot of our surveys with existing customers, right? And so what we can do is survey externally with prospects. So people who are not customers for us now.
So the topic of diversity and inclusivity is something that I've seen really prevalent around the industry. Why do you think, in particular, it's important to have women in these roles of leadership in general? Because, obviously, like you, I think a lot of people look up to you in terms of your ability to manage the research team, and especially as a female leader. Why do you think it's important to have that perspective and that voice in kind of like the decision-making roles instead of kind of just general leadership?
Yeah, so that's a really big question. Thanks for asking that. So there are a couple of ways at tackling that question. And I would say the first reason why it's important to have women in leadership is because lack of diversity is a business risk. And so if we look at, say, the US, about 80% of women actually contribute or make those purchasing decisions within the household. So 80%. And then if we look at McKinsey, they did a report or a study, and it showed that companies that had gender-rich diversity performed or were more likely to perform 15% higher in terms of getting financial returns. And if you incorporate that from an ethnic diversity perspective, it goes up to 35%. And so taking that into account, then that means that women are a fairly driving force within the economy. And so we need to design for that, right? Because if we don't design for that, we risk underserving and alienating a very powerful segment. So that's the capitalistic answer, okay? And then so from a second perspective, there is the socioeconomic or equality reason, right, for why women should be in leadership. Right? If we look back to the roots of feminism, it was about the redistribution of power and resources. And that's what leadership is. Leadership is power and resources. So if we look at it from that way, it's from an equality perspective, right? And so I guess the controversial part of it is that it's not enough to just have female leaders. What you need are good female leaders, leaders who are right and just in making their decisions that benefit people. Otherwise, if they make decisions that don't do that, then we're actually going to go backwards and then create more inequality as a result of that.
This is going to be a little bit more of a serious question, but how does it feel to have a corporate nemesis? I'm talking about Billy just because it's funny how internally as a company we all kind of see this kind of it's a family feud kind of thing with you and Billy. So I'm just kind of curious where that dynamic started coming from.
Yeah, so it all started when I brought lunch to work one day, and then Billy checked out my lunch and he said, "Hey, is that a real lunch?
Oh my god."
Like, is that what you're going to eat?
Yeah.
Or is that for your kid?
Oh my god.
And so I said, "No, it's my lunch, Billy." Although, yes, my kid could probably eat the same amount. And so it just started from there, right? And so Billy, he's not a nemesis. He's more of a annoying little brother that you love, but you also hate at the same time, because he has a way of telling the truth that you don't like to hear, but sometimes it's necessary.
Yeah, and I think it also kind of adds an element of fun to work as well in a way, but as long as he doesn't go overboard with it.
Is it amusing for everybody to listen to these
Oh yeah,
antics?
yeah.
Okay.
I just find it super amusing. I think it really says a lot about our culture as a company, and I think it's just it's just a really fun place to kind of grow. And I think with your, at least with your expertise and kind of like the roadmap that you've set up for the UX team as well, I can definitely tell that we're gonna hit a lot of new goals and a lot of new growing pains as a company accelerates. With that in mind, what are some of the things that you're looking forward to for the rest of the year?
Yeah, it's primarily from a research perspective, it's primarily revolved around growth, right? Growth in the team again. So we're looking to build the team up towards the end of the first half of the year. And so what makes that exciting is that not only does it give us more resources, but it also lets the company utilize research, and it's a great way to recognize how important research is in driving the vision of the company.
Awesome. So I guess everybody who's listening into this podcast, who's potentially interested in working it later, can look forward to that. Awesome. All right. Thanks, Abby. This is a really insightful conversation, and thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Hey, this is Joey, and thanks for listening in to this week's episode of the Minimum Viable Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, give us a follow. We have new ones coming out every week that I think you'll enjoy just as much. And in the meantime, share it around with your network. Leave a comment or send me questions at Joey Limmena. I'd be more than happy to talk about this episode and any future ones we have planned out.